So I'm really, really happy to be part of this conversation. So you're catching me right in the middle. I just switched over to this screen from watching the House and Senate convene on the floor. So my blood pressure is up a little bit after some of the antics I just witnessed on the floor. But it's a wild session already. We're just here in the middle of week 3. And it is proving to be, I would say, probably the most challenging session of my career so far for the issues that I advocate for. I am with the Arkansas Education Association and represent our members who are public school employees from around the state at the state capitol. And so I've been in that space for a long time. And I think one thing that educators don't always realize is they go into the profession because they want to be an advocate for kids. Maybe they had a teacher, or maybe there was a bus driver or somebody in their public school experience who really helped shape them and put them on a path toward opportunity, or encouraged them along the way. And they want to follow in those footsteps and build a career as an educator. But they don't always realize that class size standards are set by our policymakers. That's not something that even the districts set. Teacher salaries are set in large part by the state legislature. And then probably the biggest thing that the state legislature does is determine the per pupil funding amounts that the state sends to each of our school districts to educate our kids in our K-12 public schools. So the legislative role is huge. And a lot of people they go into the profession, or maybe even parents don't always understand that. And I think one of the really interesting things about working on public education policy in particular, that's really proven to be an interesting push-pull, is that the state has a role that our public schools have, as I think Rebecca kind of alluded to, that every level of government has a role in our public schools, right? So the federal government plays a role through the different things that they do through the Department of Education at the federal level. So does our state legislature and our state Department of Education and state board of education. And so do our local school boards at the community level and the district level. And so with everybody having a piece of that pie, there's often a big push-pull in whose agenda or whose vision for these type of things moves forward. And so we see, for example, right now, there are a couple of bills that have been introduced this session already dealing with curriculum and which curriculum and courses and things like that local districts can offer. And one of the big things I've heard from school districts is that's very unprecedented for the state to direct a district about which curriculum and courses that they can teach, right? The state sets educational standards, but it's not common practice for the state legislature to dictate to a district which curriculum that they choose. And so there's always this big push-pull between this, particularly the state and local school districts, because in addition, as I said, one of the biggest roles of the state is to provide that per pupil funding. But at the same time, the local school districts and the local community has a huge role because they also contribute their property tax funds, which is also a huge piece of funding that goes to the school. So they've got that kind of local investment that they make as well. These are some of the big things, and I'll just kind of make that opening statement and invite questions or comments, because I could bore you guys all to tears with the stuff that's going on, in our legislature. But it's going to be a very active session. One thing I do, if you all haven't had this conversation yet, I do want you all to know that under the rules that the House and Senate are operating under, there is no bill filing deadline this session, similar to the 2019 legislative session. And so we're kind of, we're in the wild, wild west out here. We don't know kind of when we get off the Bronco. We're just going to try to ride it all the way to the end. So bills could come at us at any time. And so we monitor, I do bill tracking about every 10 to 15 minutes when the legislature is in session. So you never know what bill is going to be filed minute to minute. So with that, I'll just, I'd love to hear from my colleagues here on the panel, and would love to answer any specific questions about the legislature or anything from the state perspective in regards to public education.
I do have a question, Susana. If the legislature is not supposed to traditionally dictate the curriculum for districts and what they can and cannot teach, what is traditionally the role of the legislature in terms of policymaking for education?
Yeah, so I mentioned the biggest thing is really that coming up with that per pupil spending amount. And that's really put together based on a whole series of factors. So the legislature looks at things like teacher salaries. They even look at substitute teachers who have played a really critical role in getting our schools through this school year, as we've had so many educators having to be out due to either COVID illness or exposure. Looking at transportation, looking at funding for English language learners, looking at the technology, the funds that the state sends to the districts for technology use. And so all of those factors come together to determine, and more, I haven't even covered them all. That's not an exhaustive list, but there are a multitude of factors that the state considers. And they essentially add it all up and say, this is the amount that the state is going to send to your district for each pupil that you have enrolled in your school district. So that's the first and foremost, I said, that's the biggest thing. And when you look from a state budgetary perspective, you see that public education funding is over half of our entire state budget. So when we're talking about something like that per pupil spending, it may sound like, okay, that's good. But when we're talking about it from like a macro policy and budgetary standpoint, it's a huge piece of what the whole legislature does, right? Because it takes up more than half of what our overall spending is at the state level. And I may add, just because this is kind of of particular interest to my membership, but I think in just the public dialogue lately, we've seen obviously teacher walkouts, strikes, other labor actions in other states. That's not just due to teacher pay, that's due to a lot of other kind of divestment in those states from public education over the years. But one of the things a lot of people don't necessarily know is while local school districts set their teacher salary schedule, right? So there's different salary steps based on whether you have a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, how many years you have in the profession, things like that. The state actually creates a floor. So by state law, districts have to pay teachers a certain minimum salary. And so that in 2019, the legislature passed a bill to increase that to $36,000 for a first year teacher with a bachelor's degree over 4 years. So they had 4 years to accomplish that floor. So while districts still retain the ability to kind of set their own salary schedule, the state does set that floor that they all have to at least attain, and certainly can go above.
Thanks, Susana. And Candace, you worked at the State Board of Education, advocated there many times on behalf of rural school districts. Can you talk about your work there and what happens at this state school board? I think last year and the year before, we were hearing a lot more about it than we had in years past.
Thank you, Rebecca, for inviting me to this panel. And again, I'm honored to be on the same panel with Susana and Ryan. So my experience with the State Board of Education started when I was a junior in high school back in 2005. Our school, the former Elaine School District, was on the list for districts that would be mandated to consolidate or annex because we were under that 350 number for 2 consecutive years. And that initial experience, I'm glad it did not turn me off from advocacy, because it was one of the worst, because at that time, the Act 60 law was rather new. And so the state board, it was no budging on whether or not a district would be allowed to stay open under any circumstances once they got to that 350 number. But thank God, RCA, we worked over 10 years to finally get a law passed that would allow districts, once they get to that 350 number, to remain open as long as they're fiscally, academically, and facility sound. And just last August, I think 6 more districts applied for that waiver. So since 2015, no districts have been mandated to annex or consolidate since then. So I guess going back to, so my experience with the state board, and kind of a full circle thing, last spring, last March, right before, the world shut down, I joined a school district that had gone through consolidation probably a few years after Elaine, like not long after 2006. And it was a district where a lot of times, not a lot of times, but sometimes when when another district is mandated to consolidate or annex, their receiving district allows that school to remain open. So that was the case with this, but sometime at the end in fall of 2019, the receiving district said, we want to close you. But that just can't be, a decision made. It has to unanimously get passed by the local school board. And if it's not, then it's something that's taken to the State Board of Education. So that was the case with this school district, with this school. The case was taken, or the decision was taken to the State Board of Education. And they initially contacted me probably the end of January 2020, asking like, how can we pretty much organize our community around trying to save our school. And when I tell you it was a fire that I kind of needed to keep doing this work, because it can get very exhausting in time, but it was the fire that I needed, and, bringing full circle to my why. So I advised them on how to organize and getting their stories together to bring to the State Board of Education the importance of having a student voice, and having, those school board members that were actually from that community that had to annex with their district, consolidate with their district. And they brought a full house. And I signed up to testify before the State Board on behalf of the school district. I was probably the last one. And the stories resonated. They resonated with the State Board of Education, and that school was allowed to remain open. So that hasn't always been the case with my experience with the State Board of Education, something that's favorable, but it just, it hones in the importance of being persistent, and the importance of organizing yourselves around a certain issue when you go to the State Board, so you're fully educated on what you need to be saying, and the facts of things, and not just giving opinion, but giving facts on, why local school districts are important to, especially rural communities throughout the state. Especially now, again, I'm from Elaine, so we have empty school buildings where, our children could have been utilizing them, but because of a law that was passed, probably before a lot of the kids that live in Elaine now were even born, it still affects us to this day. So, so that's kind of my experience with the State Board. Yeah. Anything else you wanted me to touch on?
Can I add to that? Is that okay if I jump in?
Yeah.
Yeah, Candace is an incredible advocate, and I've been really proud to work alongside of her, with her and her organization for a number of years. And as somebody who went to a rural school district in Arkansas, I know that voice is not always at the table without her organization, and so it's really vital work that she does. One thing that I think is super important, I think is super useful for this audience to also think about when they think about the role that the State Board plays, is that after every legislative session, after all these bills are passed into law, most give the state the authority to create rules about how the laws are implemented, right? And so, I mean, obviously you all know that a bill or a law is just a set of words on paper, but really the regulatory piece is extremely important about how that bill is going to be implemented in classrooms, at the community level, in all of those ways. So the regulatory piece actually comes before the State Board to be reviewed. So the Department of Education, if the new law grants them the authority, which most of them do, will promulgate rules that create the regulatory piece of how those new laws are going to be instituted in districts and communities. And so a huge, and I think really underappreciated, but extremely important piece of what the State Board does is they review those rules and determine if what the state has proposed looks good, or what changes we need to make. What has the public said about it, right? So a lot of times people say, well, the legislature is only really in full session every other year. What do you do the rest of your time? You're just hanging out. And a lot of it is what happens after the bills are passed into law, because that regulatory piece is how you are actually going to be impacted by those laws. And all of that comes before the State Board of Education. So that's something I really want this audience to leave here with, that the rulemaking process, it sometimes is even more important than what's in the original bill, because it's where it makes sure how the bill is implemented, where the rubber hits the road in our communities. So that's a huge role that the state board plays, and I want this audience to engage in that and engage in the public comment around that rulemaking process as they come before the state board.
And unlike local school boards and the state legislature, the State Board of Education is not elected. How is this State Board of Education? How are they chosen?
Do you want me to jump in?
Anyone? Yeah.
So they are appointed for 7 years by the governor. And so many times there will be people who were appointed to the state board from the previous administration who are still on, and then people who roll off, right? So they're staggered terms. So usually every year, every couple of years, you have one or a couple of folks that will rotate off, and then gives that governor the opportunity to appoint someone. But they're also appointed based on congressional district. And so each congressional district has folks on the state board that represent them. So you can't just have somebody roll off that's from the 3rd congressional district and replace them with somebody who lives in another part of the state. So that replacement would still come from within the district. But you're absolutely right. I mean, that's been, I think, one of the challenges that advocates have seen, is that there's not the same type of electoral lever to hold people accountable who serve on the state board, right? We can't say, we will run somebody against you, or we will hold you accountable at the ballot box next cycle, because they are appointed for these 7-year terms, which is a pretty lengthy appointment, and could serve additional ones depending on what a subsequent governor wants to do. But I think after 7 years, most of the people they've served their time and they're ready to move on with their careers, because it's a pretty big job, and you can take a lot of heat in those roles.
Ryan, you're a parent of the Little Rock School District. You've advocated at the state board and now have the opportunity to advocate at the local school board level. What's been your experience? What are the decisions that you'll be watching the local school board making now?
Thank you again, Rebecca, and Arkansas Advocates for Children and Families, for surprisingly asking me to be a part of this esteemed panel. Thank you to Susana and Candace for going first. You know, a lot of people think there's an advantage or there's a disadvantage in going last, but the advantage is you get to build on all the good sound wisdom that was already said before, you know, and so thank you guys for that. You know, well, if I can, you know, kind of thinking about something Susana said about, you know, local school boards. I mean, you know, we're one of, you know, most states, of course, excuse me, not local school boards, but about the state board and its composition. And you know, I was reading something recently about how people think electing state board members would politicize it. And, you know, it seems to me that, you know, through this appointment process, you know, that's also a politicization of it, without the kind of accountability you can give somebody who's elected. You know, we're one of, there are only 11 states, mind you, who elect state board members, and a decent handful regionally, including Louisiana and Texas. But alas, here we are with some of the longest terms afforded to state board of education members. Which is why I think the local school board is that much more important, because, you know, local school boards are bulwarks, I think, in some cases, and when it's necessary, between what the dictates of, I don't mean dictates in a negative way, but for lack of a better word, dictates of the state and the people, because we're talking about directly electing, and we gratefully had that opportunity. Well, I was grateful anyhow that we had that opportunity this November to do it. And we saw, for instance, and, you know, I know I'm not here to question the positions in particular, but to say that we saw the vulnerability of not having any say in what was going on, you know. And so I value and I'm grateful for the school board and the members of the school board And those who according to, to Title VI, have a long list of responsibilities that include, everything dealing with personnel, borrowing money, and executing contracts with folks, and all of those functional parts and pieces that are necessary to make school districts excellent, in my opinion. And so, and they do it voluntarily, every one of them, and I would even say at their own expense. I think that's probably a reality. I know at least running costs some money. I know that from experience. But, my experience as a parent with local school boards is actually recent, because I didn't have children old enough to be in school at the point that we didn't have a school board. Well, a kindergartner, but anyhow. So this was my first encounter, and one of the things I'm grateful for, and is that at least for parents in the Little Rock School District, there's access. There is an ability to engage with members of the school board, and also to engage with the meetings, because I think what this pandemic has laid bare for us is that access, because for some reason we didn't know it before, I guess, that access is an issue. Access is an equity issue. And, if we're sincere about wanting parents and families to engage, and, then we have to be serious about access. And, so I guess on a personal level, I hope we can bear with our newly elected local board, but I also hope we can do it in an intrepid fashion, whereby, because they are elected, we expect something of them. So that's I guess I'm operating from a position of hopefulness.
Thanks, Ryan. We have a couple questions from what you and Candace and Susana talked about. One's from Kristen, one's from April. The first one, can we advocate for change in the process of who sits on the board? And a similar question, are there any professional requirements for people to be appointed to the State Board of Education, like a background in education? Anyone can jump in.
I'll go to the advocacy piece of, was it you said about local, asked about local, can we advocate for change in the process of who sits? You definitely can. So those local positions, they are elected. They are appointed in situations where a vacancy occurs, and there's even a bill that Representative Les Warren is he's running now to extend that period to fill the vacancy. When something occurs, when death occurs, that's why he's extending it. But yes, you most definitely can, and I would charge younger people to run for these local school board positions. We need people that know the importance of organizing and educating yourselves on on laws and bills, and understanding the importance of having an ongoing conversation with your state elected officials, your representatives, your senators. And of course, right now they can't come and visit your school district because they're busy up here at the Capitol, but we need people in these positions that build relationships with our state elected officials, so they know what's going on locally, so they will know, what's important to you and what bills they do need to run. So definitely. And again, my charge is for you more younger people to run, and to more when you run, make sure that you understand the importance of organizing and knowing the importance of educating yourself on certain bills and things and the process before you get to that point. Anybody else can jump in. I know Ryan and Susana have a wealth of knowledge around this as well.
And I think, folks, and I have to do this for myself. I have to give myself a measure of grace for not knowing the ins and outs and the specifics, because I don't think I have to understand school finance in order to be able to ask a question about if the resources are being distributed equitably. In things in general. So I think and have witnessed and have experienced myself that there is some hesitance to say approach these really formal forums like a school board meeting, for instance, and to bring things to them without feeling inadequate or feeling like maybe I don't understand the process, or and I think that people should, and this is perhaps something we I would love to ask our board to do, that make sure people understand that you're free to be in these spaces and to bring your concerns into these spaces, and and so people are not encumbered by this idea that you have to be kind of an education activist, so you have to be somebody who has a certain set of skills and knowledge. I mean, this is, again, unfortunately, an elected form of people, and I agree, Candace, to your point, because I mean I think about not to point anybody out specifically, but for this reason, Sandrika Morning, who represents Zone 2, on Little Rock School Board, is the kind of young person I imagine you talking about, and this is somebody who is young enough to have been one of my students, and and I'm only 25, so yeah, I think, and I also mentioned her to say, and that she approached the proposition of it with the kind of openness and honest vulnerability, and it's just kind of like and I'm glad she did, and so yeah, I agree. That's my long-winded way of saying I agree exactly with what you said, Candace.
And I think just to add to what has already been said, and I think there have been some really good points, is, Ryan's right. And, I've been doing public policy related work for over a decade now, and I learn new things every single day. So there's so much to learn, whether you're working at the state level or the federal level, the local level. And I would just add to it, it is part of the responsibility for those we elect, whether it's to the school board or to the state legislature in any public position, to bring their constituents along with them as they learn more, to share that with their constituents and help build their capacity to understand the process, because we all hold a piece of the truth and we need to all be heard in shaping what our public policy looks like. So in addition to feeling that kind of maybe potentially feeling of inadequacy when you want to bring an issue forward and feeling like maybe I don't know 100%, but taking it off the table that you have to know 100% to share your perspective to inform a policy that works for the people that we're here to represent. So just wanted to add that. And I think a lot of times people who are elected don't always see that. They say it's for me to know and for me to kind of just, maybe pat you on the head with, and that's not how this is supposed to work. They have a responsibility to educate their constituents about the process as well.
And are there requirements for people who serve on the State Board of Education? And like Ryan said, there's, I guess, 11 states that have elected State Board of Education. Is it possible at all for the legislature to change the rules of how those people are appointed?
Yes. Several years ago, I think it was 2017, there was a law passed that changed the qualification to serve as, at the time, the position was the Commissioner of Education. Now, the state has undergone a transformation, as they call it, and many of the positions have been reclassified with the title of Secretary of Education. So that change was made. So it's a good example to say that the state really does have a huge role to play and in who qualifies for different positions based on the state laws that they're passing or repealing, right? So they could, passing a law also doesn't necessarily mean adding. Sometimes it means taking stuff away, right? So that's an important point as well as we think about this. And I think the other thing, back to I guess Kristen's question about can we advocate for a change in the process? Candace mentioned that Representative Warren has a bill this session to look at filling the vacancies, but also there are certain things that the legislature does that are other laws that they put in place about the process for school boards, what type of trainings that they have to receive. A big piece of serving on a school board, as I mentioned, for the legislature as well, is looking at your school budget, right? Is trying to understand how do we prioritize what it is we are funding, what are the needs of our district, what does our school community say are their priorities. So there's training around that, and all of that is mandated at the state level. So there are state laws that are in place that can always change. They can be repealed or added to, that do govern who serves on school boards and what type of kind of professional development or training that they need to receive to fulfill those roles.
And so we've talked about decisions getting made at all these different levels. How do you recommend, and then I'll get to Richard's question, how do you recommend people who are wanting to advocate figure out where in the process this decision could get made?
Well, the Arkansas Legislative website is a great resource to start with. There you can find links to the agendas from the committee agendas. You can find the members that are on each of the committees. There's a link to the videos of the actual committee meetings. So that's a great way, I guess, to start. And then become familiar or try to familiarize yourself with certain bills and issues that are coming up. And from there, email, tweet, text, call your elected official or elected officials that are on a certain committee that you want to get your point across to. So I guess that's a place to start on advocacy and how to engage with legislators.
So I'm going to build on what Candace said, because that's good information. And I would say that the starting point can even be moved back even farther. One of the things that I've noticed is the successful approach to legislators is if you can build a relationship with your elected officials before you have to come asking for something. Right. So if you are somebody who is a child advocate or a direct service provider or educator, parent, whatever your role is in the community, if they know who you are, right, before these laws are being introduced or this legislation is being introduced, or if they serve on the state board, whatever, it's really good to say, I am an expert in whatever my field is, because 9 times out of 10, they are not an expert in that. And so they will actually learn to rely on you to help inform their position, right? So they are also looking for information. I think it's important to remember people come into public service from all walks of life, right? Farmers, bankers, educators, right? And so none of us are experts on every piece of legislation that we have to consider. I'm not an elected official, but that elected officials have to consider. And so I think it's really important for us to, as early as possible, as soon as people put themselves out there as a candidate, say, hey, these are some issues I care about. I want to put them on your agenda, put them on your radar, and I want to establish myself as somebody who you can turn to as a resource and who I have built some rapport and trust with before these bills start flying, right, at the legislature or issues are considered before the state board, that they know that when you come to them, you've established yourself in that way. And so I think that's a really important. And another thing, I just wanted to share a resource here in the chat, if that's okay with you, Rebecca. I would invite everybody to click on that, save that bookmark that link. It is a resource that we've created. We created it for our members, but I'm happy for all of you to have it here today. And it's hot off the press. It's just like 5 days old, but it's just a really quick and dirty summary of how you can engage in the process. It gives you a refresher on how a bill becomes law. It talks about some of the things that people don't always know that the state legislature does, like teacher salaries and things like that people aren't always cognizant of. It tells you the number to call if you want to leave a message for your lawmaker. And it even shows school district by school district, which state rep and state senator represents every one of the districts and their contact information. So it's something you can refer back to, keep in your back pocket as we go through the next couple of years with this set of lawmakers, so that you have that at hand. And even if you're somebody who's brand new to this and said, she's telling me to email, but I don't know what to say, or I feel intimidated about calling, it even gives you some pointers about a good way to approach it. So really just want you to feel comfortable and confident. You don't have to know it all. I guarantee you already know enough to begin to raise your voice and help inform this process.
So we also had a question from Richard. Are you all familiar with HB 1231? If so, can you please share more information?
Can I jump on in there?
Yes.
Thank you. So this is one of State Representative Mark Lowry's 2 bills that Susana alluded to earlier, dealing with curriculum. And I saw your question, Richard, and I had the bill up actually. And so I went and highlighted and separated and pasted this here. This is the crux of what Mark Lowry is saying is the problem and so on. So
You're cutting out of it, Ryan.
Am I? Testing. Am I good to go? Am I here with you?
You're really quiet.
Okay. How about now?
Still a little quiet. Maybe move the mic up just a little bit.
How about that?
Just no. Everyone, you'll be fine. Talk at your highest level.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm borrowing some kids' headphones. So yeah. So anyhow, it's a reflexive bill template that's been imitated in other states, and it mirrors something that our Senator Tom Cotton tried to bring before the American Congress, and it's a really kind of a reflexive denial of something that was, I think, very carefully put together by historians from all over the country. And it's also weird because based on the restrictions and based on the restrictions of his previous bill, you couldn't even teach, say, about the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, the first and most prominent multiracial union in the country of farmers in the Arkansas Delta. So you couldn't teach that. You couldn't teach, for instance, of, and I know Susana's taken a recent trip here, of Jerome, Arkansas, where there's an obelisk out there as a symbol of the folks who were interned there during World War II, Japanese families, down there in the Delta also. And so, you're talking about dangerous, in my mind, restrictions that I don't think he understands have these unintended consequences, because we're trying to thumb our nose at the New York Times and the liberal elite or whatever the case may be. And then you also have to imagine which districts would this, speaking very frankly about which places would actually teach this, which districts would suffer under, some removal of resources if this happens. Which is why we should have passed something dealing with racial impact back 2 sessions ago.
I'll jump in. You done, Ryan?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Okay. I'm from Elaine, Arkansas. And I think I said this earlier, but I was part of the last graduating class from that high school before we were mandated to annex Marble. If you're not familiar with Elaine, it has a very ugly truth. The Elaine race massacre, the massacre of 1919. Growing up there, that was not something that was talked about. It was not something that, you know, we had in our books, our Arkansas history books. So seeing 1218 and 1231 come up, it's an insult. To me, it's a way to try to muffle some of these ugly truths, some of these things that happen where, you know, we live, work, and play to this day. Ugly truths that have happened in our own state. So RCA, Rural Community Alliance, we're against both of these bills, of course, and as the reasons that Ryan and Susana have spoken, that they've spoken of, but it's just, it's a very dangerous and divisive bill. What they are both 1218 and 1231.
And if you have any questions, you can type them in the chat box, but I'll ask another. You know, we're in the middle of a pandemic right now. How can people watch the local school board meetings? Are all the school boards live streaming their meetings or only some? How can people participate in that process? And I guess the same questions for the state board. The legislature, we've already talked about streamed online.
Yeah, the state board, I'm sorry, go ahead, Ryan.
No, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Just to add, the state board does stream their meetings online. And they did that prior to the pandemic, which I think was an important access point for a lot of people to monitor those conversations. And another important thing that I want to note about the State Board of Education, since Candace gave a really good example about how they organized and put their schools issues in front of the state board. And I've mentioned about the important role they play in considering the regulations that govern the laws that we all live under. Their agenda must be publicly posted 10 days prior to the meeting. So I actually have a calendar alert that pops up every month, 10 days prior to their meeting, to review what is going to be considered on their agenda. So that's a really important point for advocates to know, that you effectively have 10 days to kind of be responsive to whatever might appear on that agenda that month for the state board. So that's just, I think, just a really useful bit of information for those of you who want to engage in that space. And then the other thing that I will say is, I believe, and maybe Ryan and Candace have more information, but I think it varies district to district at the school board level, who is streaming. I will say there are some bills that were just filed late yesterday. I haven't fully wrapped my mind around about changing some of the statutes about what's considered a meeting and can electronic, holding meetings electronically. What does that mean? What does that mean in state law? What does that mean for open records laws? What does that mean for notification, right? So now that we've been living in this virtual space, I think we've moved past, I think, what some of the laws have provided for. And so there's some legislation that's been introduced that I think that will start to address that. But I think it varies district to district whether they are live streaming their proceedings. And like I said, Ryan and Candace may know more.
I'll give you two very different districts, two very different scenarios, only because it's what I kind of think of. But, of course, I think the Little Rock School District has always done the best it could in terms of having accessible meetings. I mean, I remember, of course, before the internet age, when the meetings were on public access channels. But then, I like to make a distinction between what we could really consider public, to Susana's point, these days. And, in the event that, we start needing stadiums for people who show up at school board meetings, what do we do then? And then, of course, in this current context where, people are necessarily separate and apart from each other. And so I think the distinction, again, I like to make is between whether or not these meetings are public and announced and promoted, that maybe there can be at some level some promotion of these meetings as you know, vital parts of the community. And because I mean, you know, you can go to the Little Rock School District page, of course, and you can you know, you can find it. But these days, when I get and I get them gratefully, several dozen messages per day from the district itself and from teachers and administrators. You know, I've never gotten one that says, remember that the school board meeting is happening at this time and it's airing in this space. So, you know, and I that may be a little nitpicky. I mean, you know, I think we are doing the best we can, but there it is.
And I just want to add to that there are districts and many public entities who even before the pandemic did try to make their meetings available for people to watch and engage in. But obviously all of that is contingent on access to high-speed internet, which is obviously a massive barrier to participation to people across the state, and not just rural communities. That's something that impacts people in more populated areas because we have not built out that infrastructure as we should. So it impacts Arkansans in large parts of our state. So that access is contingent on that. So I just want to say that too, that we can't just assume everybody has that to participate.
Right.
And that moves me to my next question. I think Candace can start off with, because Candace is, the Rural Community Alliance is advocating for greater broadband access. What are, you know, we're Kids Count Week at the Capitol, so we've talked about a couple bills that will be coming up at the legislature this year, but what are some other pieces of legislation people on the meeting today should be watching out for?
Susana, you can start. I need to go get my other computer.
Sure. Well, as I mentioned, really the biggest and boldest thing that the legislature considers every year, whether it's in a general session or next year, which will be a fiscal session, is how much the state is going to put toward per pupil spending for each of our school districts. One thing before I get too far down this road that I do want to point out that per pupil spending also goes to charter schools in our state, and they actually do not have a democratically elected school board. So even though they receive those public funds, we don't have that same type of democratic lever to use when engaging with those school boards. So I think that's an important distinction here as well for the children who attend those schools. They do not attend schools governed by a publicly or democratically elected school board. But it's that per pupil spending amount. And so the recommendation in Arkansas, we budget in 2-year cycles. So the legislature has recommended that we increase our per pupil spending by 2.33% in the next fiscal year. And then again by 2.33% in the subsequent year. And this actually represents the largest proposed increase in public education funding in over 14 years in our state. So one thing I want to note is that as I am in contact with my colleagues around the country who do public education policy work, many states are actually experiencing a significant budget crisis. That is not, in fact, the case here in Arkansas, where we are making a really significant investment in public schools over the next 2 years. So I do want to say that proposal will go into a bill and will be filed this session. We hope that proposal stays intact and that they don't try to reduce it in some way as it goes through the legislative process, but that's a huge thing. And we're talking about, I mean, like I said, over 50% of the budget, right? So we're talking about a huge chunk of change when we talk about anything of a multiplier of 2.33%. It doesn't sound like that much, but once you do the math on it, it's a huge chunk of change. And another thing is the governor has a proposal to increase the not the minimum teacher salary rather, but the average teacher salary. And so he is trying to increase that. And it's not completely clear as to what mechanism that he will use to do that as far as how to fund it. But I know that they're looking at investing another $25 million in helping school districts increase their teacher pay to increase that average teacher salary. Just one of the big issues in our state around recruiting and retention of educators is that we have a wide gulf in teacher pay, right? So some districts can pay people, fairly well, and some districts are barely able to make the minimum salary. So some people are literally making as much as twice in some school districts as some districts in another part of the state. And sometimes even within a county, there's a massive disparity, school district to school district. And so I know that that's something that he's trying to get at here. We've been advocating in that space, trying to shape what that looks like so it can address that. Those are two huge and costly issues that will be on the agenda for public ed. And as I mentioned, there's no bill filing deadline. We're just in week 3. So there's a lot of things that we don't know. I do anticipate a voucher bill to come forward this session. Unfortunately, Arkansas does have one voucher program on the books, but this could potentially add another one to it. The bill has not been filed, so I don't know the final details. But that is something that would potentially divert public funds to pay for private schools. And one of the things that's important about public education, I sure don't have to tell this audience, but we educate every child who shows up every day, right? In a public school, they don't discriminate or turn children away. And private schools can determine who is enrolled in their school. And that's a clear difference. And so it has been our position to oppose voucher expansion, voucher bills, because we do believe strongly that public funds should go for public schools and have that level of public oversight over tax dollars so that we know that it's being spent in service to our students.
So the basis of RCA's work is public education advocacy. We have a vision for just and thriving rural communities. So we, of course, support the bills that Susana mentioned. In addition to those, Senator Ingram has a bill. It's concerning funding based on the ADM, the average daily membership of a school district. And it allows them the effects of COVID-19, because we know the school count is fluctuating due to that. So it allows funding to remain as is and not be affected by the decline in enrollment that districts may be experiencing now, because it was the end of last year when it was stated that 5,000, I think, plus students were unaccounted for. They don't know, they haven't heard from them, districts haven't heard from them. So we know those numbers would account for, if this bill is not passed, the certain districts losing funding. So that's something that we're in support of. There is a bill that passed out of House Ed yesterday, House Bill 1151, and it's to suspend the public school rating system for the 2020 and 2021 school year. That's very important. So that would suspend the A through F rating of schools, and we're very much so in support of that.
And breaking news, Candace, just before we went live with you all today, the House passed that on the floor with 94 votes. So that happened just moments before we started. So that bill has advanced and headed to the Senate. So we are all supportive of that bill. So
yes. In addition to that, the governor has proposed, and they say to the state, $30 million for broadband, and we very much so need that. As we all know, at the end of with CARES Act money, the Arkansas CARES Act committee, they funded the Arkansas Rural Connect program. A certain community that we work with in the North Central region of the state, they were awarded that money, but they had to turn it back because they did not have, them and the potential provider did not have time to deploy the services before the end of last year. So you have districts or you have communities that still very much so need better connectivity. So we're definitely in support of that. I was on AEA's conference. I watched it live, not live, but I watched it last Saturday. And I know Senator Missy Irvin, she's wanting more than 30 million. Hey, we want more too, but we will be fine with 30 million being a start. Something else that we're also watching is House Bill 1176, and it is to ensure that reimbursement of the Arkansas Medicaid program for certain behavioral and mental health services provided via telemedicine. So that is very important, especially for our children and community members that are receiving these telemedicine services, and it allows Medicaid to be billed for them. I have to thank my sister-in-law for bringing my attention to this, but it's very much so important that especially our communities that need this kind of help, that they still have access to these behavior and mental health services via telemedicine, and Medicaid is actually being able to be reimbursed for them. So those are just a few things that we're watching right now.
And I just want to add quickly, Rebecca, and totally agree with Candace's, the issue she raises. This is a major issue, and I'm sorry I haven't raised it till just now, but just right around Christmas, Congress passed an additional COVID-related relief bill. And so that means that in Arkansas alone, the federal government is sending more than $500 million with a B, $558 million into the state to our K-12 public schools. Those dollars are, I think it'll probably be considered tomorrow in the Joint Budget Committee. I haven't looked at the agenda. It wasn't posted right before I came on here. Maybe after it may be posted by now. But that's $500 million for our schools to be able to be responsive to the challenges that have arisen due to COVID, whether it's expanding leave for teachers who've been out due to illness or exposure, looking at helping the ventilation systems in schools, making sure they're safer for people, for the students and for the educators who work in them. But there are several different things that those funds can be utilized for. It's a huge opportunity for our school districts. So $558 million, $500 million is being sent into our state from that newly passed federal COVID relief bill. So we have a huge opportunity to make some improvements and to support the people delivering public education on the ground.
Well, thank you, Susana, for leaving us on a high note. That could be a huge help for school districts and for families. So thank you so much. And we appreciate you and Candace and Ryan for being here today and sharing information about how to advocate at multiple different levels of school policy making. We have one more event today at 4 p.m. Senator Greg Letting will have a Facebook Live event, and we'll be taking your questions about the legislative process if you want to check that out. And we have a few more activities tomorrow. We appreciate all of you being here during Kids Count Week at the Capitol, and we'll see you soon. Thanks.
Thank you.